I drove for 10 hours for Thanksgiving with my family. We didn't invite you. My mom said, let's just pretend she's not here. Dad said while my brother nearly choked on a turkey laughing, and he told me to just leave. I smiled and told them to say goodbye to the $5,000 I promised to give him. Their faces quickly turned pale, and then Dad. My name is Claire Bennett. And that Thanksgiving I made the mistake of thinking things had changed. I had driven from Chicago to my parents' place in rural Pennsylvania, stopping only once in Ohio for gas and a soggy burger. I hadn't seen my family in a while, and even though the last few years had been strained, I wanted to believe distance had softened something. Ethan was about to start college, and weeks earlier I told Mom I wanted to help. I had saved $5,000 for his rent and supplies. Mom barely reacted. She only said, "Okay," in the same tone someone might use if I offered to mail a greeting card. I should have heard the warning. I didn't. I pulled into the driveway at sunset. The house looked exactly the same. White siding, peeling paint near the garage, the old wind chime clinking on the porch. I used my key and stepped inside. Turkey and stuffing filled the air, and for half a second the smell fooled me into thinking I was home. Then Mom turned from the kitchen and said, "We didn't invite you." No smile. No hug. Dad came in from the garage, glanced at me and said, "Let's just pretend she's not here." Ethan sat at the table scrolling through his phone. When he looked up, he started laughing. "Seriously, Claire, just go." I should have left. Instead, I sat on the old couch from my childhood. Nobody asked why I was there or how the drive had been. They continued preparing dinner as if I were furniture. When everyone sat down, I stood at the end of the table and waited until they took their first bites. I didn't yell. I simply said, "Since I'm not really here, I'm taking back the $5,000 I was going to give Ethan for rent." The room went silent. Mom froze. Dad slowly looked up. Ethan stopped chewing and stared at him, as if waiting for instructions. Then the performance started. Dad found the warm voice he normally saved for moments when he needed something. Mom suddenly remembered I might want a plate. Ethan pretended the money didn't matter, even though I knew he couldn't afford rent without it. I let the silence stretch, then sat in Grandpa's old chair at the head of the table. Nobody stopped me. "I've been meaning to tell you something," I said. "Grandpa's house. This house. He left it to me." Mom blinked. Dad dropped his fork. Ethan stared. I pulled the official envelope from my coat and placed the will beside the mashed potatoes. Grandpa had died a few months earlier. I had gone to the reading alone. My parents hadn't bothered, and Ethan hadn't gone to the funeral. They had no idea Grandpa left me everything. The house, his savings, his car, and several investments. I was the one who visited him, ran errands, sat with him, and cared when his health declined. They had ignored him for years. Dad's face turned red. He said there had to be a mistake. Mom demanded to know why I had hidden it. Ethan whispered, "What the hell?" Before I could answer, someone knocked. It was my cousin Brian, who hadn't spoken to me since we were teenagers after a ridiculous Xbox argument. He walked in, saw the tension, grabbed a beer from the refrigerator, and dropped onto the couch. Then he grinned. "Heard about Grandpa's will. Someone had seen the probate filing, and family gossip had done the rest. Brian wasn't there to mourn Grandpa. He was there to claim a piece. He asked whether I planned to be reasonable. I asked what that meant. 'Not being selfish,' he said. 'Grandpa wouldn't want you hoarding everything.' I told him. 'Grandpa specifically left everything to me because he didn't trust any of you.' Brian went quiet for 3 seconds, then launched into a speech about equal shares, family loyalty, and a business he wanted to start. He even suggested we could sign something that night. Mom said Brian might have a point. Dad, who minutes earlier wanted to pretend I didn't exist, asked whether we could review the will together, as a family. Ethan leaned forward. "You're really not giving me the rent money?" I looked at all of them. "No." Then I stood. "And one more thing. I'm not visiting. I live here now. This house is mine legally, completely. There's no sharing and no family discussion. You're all guests." Brian laughed. "You really think you can walk in here and act like the queen?" I took out my phone and told him the county sheriff was one tap away. I asked whether he wanted to explain why he was drinking in a house he didn't own and hadn't been invited into. His expression changed instantly. He accused me of power tripping and said I would regret turning my back on blood. I opened the front door. "You already turned your back on me." He left. Mom tried the soft voice next, suggesting we calm down and talk after I rested from the drive. That was when I gave them the real deadline. "You have 1 week, 7 days. After that, I want you out." Dad looked as if I had slapped him. Mom asked where they were supposed to go. Ethan said, "You're kicking out your own family?" I answered, "You kicked me out years ago. You just never said it clearly." Mom cried. Dad stormed into the garage. Ethan called me cruel and promised to tell everyone what I had done. I told him to go ahead. What they didn't know was that the house was only the beginning. Before the week was over, I would discover that someone had emptied Grandpa's safe while he was dying, and the person who did it was still living under my roof. They didn't start packing that night. That was the first sign they still thought I was bluffing. Dad sat in the living room watching football with the volume louder than usual, as if noise could drown out what I had said. Mom cleaned the kitchen in complete silence. Ethan disappeared into his room and shut the door hard enough to shake one of Grandpa's framed photographs on the hallway wall. I slept badly, but I didn't regret the deadline. The next morning, I began treating the house like what it legally was. Mine. I changed the Wi-Fi password, removed my parents' names from utility accounts where I could, and stopped paying for anything that wasn't necessary to protect the property. Dad knocked on my bedroom door around noon and said we needed to talk like adults. I told him to email me. His expression told me he finally understood that the daughter he used to intimidate wasn't coming back. 2 days later, I noticed something that changed everything. Grandpa had kept an old combination safe in the master bedroom for as long as I could remember. When I was a kid, Ethan and I used to joke that it contained buried treasure. After Grandpa died, the estate inventory showed that the safe held legal documents, collectible coins, several savings bonds, old military medals, and personal papers. When I entered the room, the safe door was hanging open. Inside was nothing. Not one envelope. Not one coin. I stood there staring at bare metal shelves, feeling a coldness that had nothing to do with November. I immediately found Mom and asked where everything was. She barely looked at me before saying, "Your grandfather probably emptied it before he died." The lie came too quickly. I told her that. Her face tightened, and she walked away. That night, a Facebook message appeared from my cousin Laura. I hadn't spoken to her in years, and unlike Brian or Aunt Carla, Laura had never participated much in the family drama. Her first line was simple. "Claire, I need to tell you something about Grandpa's safe." She explained that Grandpa had given her a spare key years earlier when she helped him with errands. 2 weeks before he died, Mom called Laura in a panic and asked to borrow it. Mom claimed she needed some old paperwork. Laura gave her the key and was told never to mention it because Grandpa was confused and would get upset. Laura had believed her until she heard about the inheritance dispute. "I think she cleaned it out," she wrote. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner." I read the message repeatedly. Grandpa had been dying, and while I was checking on him, bringing groceries and driving him to appointments, my own mother had apparently been searching his safe. The next morning, I asked Laura if she would give a written statement to the estate attorney. She agreed. I forwarded everything immediately. The attorney confirmed that the contents of the safe had already been documented in Grandpa's financial records. If property listed as estate assets had been removed without permission, this wasn't merely a family disagreement. A hearing could be requested. Suddenly, the argument was no longer about whether Mom deserved something. It was about where stolen property had gone. That evening I found Dad smoking in the garage. I asked him directly what he and Mom had taken. He stared at me and said, I don't know what you're talking about. I told him that was fine. If he knew nothing, he wouldn't object to me securing my property. The locksmith arrived the next morning. Every exterior lock was replaced. Front door, back door, garage, shed. Mom stood in the kitchen with her arms folded while the locksmith worked. Ethan recorded part of it on his phone, probably imagining some dramatic social media post about his evil older sister. I didn't care. What they didn't know was that Laura's statement had already gone to the estate attorney, along with a formal report documenting the missing items. A hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. By the 4th day, the house felt like a pressure cooker. Dad stopped pretending to be reasonable and started slamming doors and cabinets. Ethan barely came out of his room. Mom became unnervingly quiet. Then, Aunt Carla arrived. She hadn't visited that house in nearly a decade, but she walked through the front door with the confidence of someone who believed family history gave her ownership. Carla had always been my parents' fixer. When Ethan damaged Dad's truck as a teenager, she was the one who convinced everyone to blame me because I was supposedly mature enough to handle it. She sat at the kitchen table, patted the chair beside her, and said, "Claire, everyone needs to calm down. You've got this family terrified." I asked her how I was responsible for their fear when they were the ones who emptied a dying man's safe. Carla smiled and said Laura had always loved attention. I pulled up Laura's written statement and the attorney's email confirming the hearing. Carla barely glanced at the screen, so I asked the question nobody wanted me to ask. "Where is everything?" Mom suddenly started wiping an already clean countertop. Dad stared at the ceiling. Carla's smile twitched. I repeated myself. The bonds, the coins, Grandpa's medals, his documents. Where are they? Carla finally looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Gone." I asked what that meant. Her answer was almost casual. Mom had debts. Dad owed back taxes. Some valuables had been sold. Some money had been used to keep them afloat. It saved them, Carla said. You should be grateful. I actually laughed. Grateful that they stole from Grandpa while he was dying? Carla stood and straightened her coat. Her voice changed. You don't want to go to war with your own blood, Claire. You aren't ready for what that looks like. I opened the front door and told her we would find out. She left without another word, but her warning stayed with me. That night, around 2 a.m, I woke to a scraping sound from downstairs. I quietly followed it to the garage and saw Ethan crouched beside Grandpa's old metal toolbox. He was trying to force something open. When he noticed me, he froze. On the floor between us was a small lockbox with its lid partially lifted. Inside were old envelopes covered in Grandpa's handwriting. At least 10 of them. Ethan stepped backward when I approached. I picked up the top envelope. Across the front, Grandpa had written, "For Claire only. If you're reading this, it means I was right." I asked Ethan where he found the box. He wouldn't answer. I took it upstairs and locked my door. For the rest of the night, I sat on my bedroom floor reading Grandpa's letters one by one. The first was dated almost a year before his death. He wrote that my parents had suddenly become interested in his finances as soon as his health declined. They asked about deed. The second letter contained documentation for a private account Grandpa had created in my name. The balance was more than $80,000. I had never known it existed. The third held a key and an address for a storage unit 2 towns away. Grandpa wrote that he had moved anything truly important out of the house because he no longer trusted the people living around him. His medals, personal journals, financial records, photographs, and even a backup copy of his will were supposedly inside. He had anticipated someone trying to make documents disappear. Every letter repeated the same painful truth. He trusted me because I had never treated him like an inheritance waiting to happen. By sunrise, whatever hesitation I still had was gone. I hired a security company and shortened the deadline. 48 hours. No negotiations, no extensions. When noon arrived 2 days later, I went downstairs and told them it was over. Mom cried and said she had nowhere to go. Dad tried to bargain. Ethan called me heartless and said I was throwing away my own family. I looked at him and said, You should have thought about family before helping people steal from a dying man. That finally silenced him. They packed fast after that. Dad carried the last box to the driveway, turned around, and asked whether I was really willing to turn my back on them forever. You turned yours first, I said. I just finally caught up. They drove away before sunset. Aunt Carla tried to return once, but I met her on the porch with paperwork from the estate attorney and told her the next step would be a restraining order if she entered the property again. Brian called 3 times. I ignored every call. That night, for the first time since arriving, the house was completely silent. I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. The family I had just removed from my home was about to discover that losing the house was only the beginning, and the storage unit Grandpa left behind contained enough evidence to destroy every story they had been telling about me. For about 2 weeks after they left, I convinced myself the silence meant it was finished. I changed the locks again, installed cameras around the property, and stopped answering calls from relatives I barely remembered. Ethan posted a long Facebook story claiming I had stolen Grandpa's inheritance, made our parents homeless, and abandoned my own brother right before college. The comments filled with sympathy from people who hadn't visited Grandpa once during his final year. A few relatives sent me private messages asking to hear my side, but I recognized the pattern. They weren't looking for truth. They were looking for details they could repeat. I blocked them one by one. A month later, I sold Grandpa's house. I got a good price for it, moved to a quiet town near a lake, took a new job, changed my phone number, and tried to build a life where every ringing phone didn't make my shoulders tense. I brought the lockbox of Grandpa's letters with me. Everything else, I wanted to leave behind. Then the mail started. The first envelope had no return address. Inside was a blank sheet of paper with one word printed in the center: leech. The second said traitor. The third said karma. One came with a photograph of Grandpa's old house, a red circle drawn around it. That one bothered me enough that I changed how my mail was handled. First I used a post office box, then a private forwarding service. I stopped using my full name online. I told myself I wasn't afraid. I was simply done making it easy for them to reach me. Still, every anonymous envelope reminded me that leaving a toxic family physically didn't necessarily mean they had accepted losing access to you. A few weeks later, I received something more official. Aunt Carla, Mom, and Dad had filed a lawsuit. They claimed emotional distress, wrongful eviction, and defamation. Somehow, they argued that I had destroyed their reputation by telling relatives they stole from Grandpa, even though most of the family learned about the missing safe from Ethan's own social media posts and their increasingly desperate attempts to defend themselves. Their evidence included screenshots of Ethan's Facebook story describing me as unstable, greedy, and vindictive. When my lawyer read the filing, she actually laughed. Then she looked at me and said, "This is irritating, but it's also useful. They've just put a lot of their claims in writing." We counterclaimed. Harassment, defamation, conversion of estate property. Documentation from the probate process showed which items had been listed before Grandpa's death and which had disappeared afterward. Laura provided her written statement about giving Mom the safe key. The estate attorney confirmed the validity of Grandpa's updated will. We had dates, signatures, inventory records, and a paper trail. Their version of events depended mostly on repeating the word family, as though it were a legal argument. Once the counterclaim was filed, the anonymous letters stopped for a few days. Then my phone began ringing from blocked numbers. Sometimes nobody spoke. Sometimes I heard breathing. Once, someone left a voicemail with an old song playing softly in the background. It wasn't a direct threat, but it was designed to tell me they could still reach me. That was what finally pushed me to use the storage unit key Grandpa had hidden in the lockbox. I had carried it for months without going. Part of me was afraid that opening the unit would drag me deeper into a story I desperately wanted finished. Another part of me knew Grandpa had gone to extraordinary lengths for a reason. So one Saturday morning, I drove 2 towns over, found the storage facility, signed the access paperwork, and stood in front of a narrow metal door with the key trembling slightly between my fingers. When I rolled the door upward, dust and cold air came toward me. Inside were neatly labeled plastic bins, several old trunks, framed photographs wrapped in blankets, and a cardboard box sitting on a folding table. In Grandpa's handwriting it said, Claire Final. Everything he had promised was there. His military medals, journals, family photographs, copies of financial records, receipts proving that several expenses Dad had once bragged about paying had actually been covered by Grandpa. There was even another certified copy of the will. Grandpa hadn't been paranoid. He had been prepared. But the real shock was inside the cardboard box. There were two objects, a flash drive and a small wooden case. I plugged the drive into my laptop while sitting on the concrete floor of the storage unit. Grandpa appeared on the screen. He looked thinner than I remembered him, but his voice was steady. He explained why he had changed the will. He spoke about Mom suddenly visiting after months of silence once she learned his health was declining. He described Dad asking about bank balances and property values. He mentioned Ethan joking about getting Grandpa's car before Grandpa was even dead. Then, Grandpa talked about me. He said I was the only person who called without asking for something, the only one who brought groceries, sat through medical appointments, and listened when he was afraid. In another recording, he read from notes he had kept after conversations with my parents. Some of what they had said about me was brutal. Dad had called me useless because I lived far away. Mom had apparently told Grandpa that I would waste any inheritance because daughters eventually marry and give everything to another family anyway. Hearing that sentence felt like someone pressing on an old bruise I had spent years pretending wasn't there. Grandpa looked directly into the camera in the final recording. Claire, if you ever start believing you were cruel for walking away, remember this. People who love you don't require you to destroy yourself to prove it. I watched that part 3 times. I had spent months defending my decisions as though I were arguing a case in court. Grandpa's words reminded me that I didn't actually need a unanimous verdict from people who benefited from my silence. I closed the laptop and opened the wooden box. Inside were 4 sealed envelopes, one for Mom, one for Dad, one for Ethan, one for Carla. Grandpa's final words to each of them. I didn't open the letters. I didn't have the right. And strangely, I didn't want to know what they said. Instead, I photographed the 4 sealed envelopes sitting inside the box and sent the image to my parents through the only email address they still had for me. My message was short. These are Grandpa's final letters to you. They remain sealed. If the harassment continues, they will stay unread permanently. No more anonymous mail, no more calls, no more relatives contacting me on your behalf. This is your one chance. I stared at the screen for several minutes before pressing send. There was no answer that day, or the next, but the calls stopped. The letters stopped. Nobody showed up at my new house. For the first time, they understood that I possessed something money couldn't replace. The lawsuit slowly collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Once discovery began and my lawyer requested financial records connected to Grandpa's missing property, their enthusiasm disappeared quickly. Carla stopped calling herself the family mediator. Dad stopped insisting there had never been anything valuable in the safe. Mom stopped claiming Grandpa had voluntarily given them everything. Their attorney began discussing settlement rather than trial. I didn't need public revenge or some dramatic courtroom confession. I wanted distance, documentation, and an ending. Eventually, that was what I got. The old house now belongs to a quiet couple with 2 children. Before they moved in, I left a short note welcoming them and telling them I hoped the place would become something peaceful for their family. No stories about betrayal. No warnings about ghosts. Just a clean slate. My own place near the lake is smaller, but every object inside it belongs there because I chose it. I started learning guitar badly. I found a therapist I see twice a month. Some sessions are about my family. Some aren't. That alone feels like progress. My life is no longer organized around what Mom thinks, what Dad demands, what Ethan posts, or what Carla tells everyone. The 4 letters are still sealed. Sometimes I wonder whether my parents think about them. Maybe Ethan imagines Grandpa apologizing to him. Maybe Carla assumes hers contains something she could use against me. I'll probably never know. I keep the wooden box in a cabinet with Grandpa's other things, not as leverage anymore, but as a reminder. My family spent years teaching me that love meant obligation, silence, money, and forgiveness, without accountability. Grandpa taught me something different at the very end. Last I heard, Mom, Dad, and Ethan were sharing an apartment and struggling with the rent. Ethan had to change his college plans because the $5,000 he laughed about losing never came back. They still blame me, according to Laura. Maybe they always will. I used to imagine that one day they would finally understand what they had done and apologize. I don't anymore. They became strangers long before I removed them from Grandpa's house. I simply stopped giving strangers unlimited access to my life. And the strange thing is, I'm not angry now. I'm not waiting for karma. I don't wake up hoping their lives get worse. Most mornings, I make coffee, look out over the lake, and think about absolutely nothing related to them. That might be the biggest victory of all. They spent years making me feel invisible. In the end, I didn't destroy them, expose them publicly, or beg them to finally see me. I just left them exactly what they had given me for years: distance.